joined by Sal Mercogliano, the master of what's going on with shipping, and the guy to talk to when it comes to it's seemingly every shipping, logistics, current events. We got port strikes going on. We've got a lot of our customers, of people in industry who follow your podcast and your YouTube channel. What's going on with shipping? But I wanted to give a little bit of a deep dive for our folks. Sal, you know this better than I, and in much more depth. So I guess the first thing I would ask you is, can you give us a quick readout, like what's going on and where are we at current state?
Yeah, so I mean, you've got the ILA, the International Longshoremen Association, which represent the dock workers in 14 ports from Boston down to Houston, walked out on midnight at October 1st. Their big issue is obviously wages and automation. That's the heart of the issue right there. The U.S. Maritime Alliance, which is a consortium made up of the ocean shipping carriers, the port associations, and the labor stevedoring companies, have put on the table a proposal. Now, the initial proposal was basically a 22% pay raise. That was rejected by the ILA, and it went down to the wire. The Maritime Alliance put up a new offer, 50% pay raise. They took automation and semi-automation off the books for any changes in the ports, and also offered additional money for retirements, for medical. It was a very lucrative offer. But the issue here, I think, more than anything else, is the ILA wanted the strike. They wanted this to make the news cycle. I did an interview the other day for the Christian Science Monitor, and they asked me the question, why do you think the ILA did this? I said, so that the Christian Science Monitor would write about supply chain and logistics, because that's the only way it happens. And I think the ILA is trying to make their point. They have obviously issues. When they negotiated their last master contract and it went into effect in 2018, if you look at the money that was coming in by the ocean carriers in that decade before that, it was flat. I mean, they were negative years. 2018, they have negative quarters in terms of making money. If you look at the 6 years since 2018, it is record profit. I mean, in a couple of years there, you had the ocean carriers making more money than Google and Amazon. And so you have the laborers talking this. On the flip side, I think the Maritime Alliance has a very legitimate issue about automation and improving the throughput of U.S. ports. That has been an issue. People want to be able to get their containers off the ship and into their hands faster, and that is the problem. The issue is not getting the container off the ship. It's when it's in the yard, it's in the terminal, and it's all the associated issues with that. And I think what we need is both sides to sit down at that table and negotiate and hammer out a transition. The ILA wants to be careful of its current employees and its retired employees. At the same time, the Maritime Alliance realizes we're not going to build a lot of new container terminals in the United States, which means you have to make the existing terminals more efficient and more effective.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's that role of technology, a lot of tension around leveraging technology for efficiency, addressing worker concerns about job security. It's definitely a challenging, tricky scenario. I wanted to transition a little bit. We have this congestion likely to hit West Coast coming days or weeks. Maybe do we think about the solidarity of those workers? Is that, how are you thinking about that? And have you heard anything, read anything, seen anything that may potentially influence those types of negotiations?
Well, I mean, you got to remember when you saw Harold Daggett, the president of the ILA, on the picket line, standing right next to him was the president of the ILWU from the West Coast. And so, I mean, they're showing that solidarity. Now, solidarity is great. Contracts are another thing. The contract of the ILWU prohibits them from striking. So this is something they've just hammered out last year, their agreement. So they have to work. Now, there is a potential issue where if you can identify cargo coming from the East Coast that's coming onto the West Coast, that they may be able to halt that cargo. I don't know how you do that. I don't think they're going to have that kind of visibility. And if you listen to the port directors in LA and Long Beach, they're loving this. They love the idea of this business coming in. I mean, you just saw Gene Soroka out there talking about the fact that we're at 70% capacity. We've got plenty of room. Come on back to LA and Long Beach. And what we have to always remember is that in the United States, ports are run by local and municipal and state governments, and they compete against each other. And as much as you may see labor in solidarity, the port terminals are like, this is great business for us. LA and Long Beach had been losing business consistently since 2017. We've seen that downhill trajectory largely due to the new lane of the Panama Canal that allowed container ships to go through, now much bigger. Used to be you were constrained to 4,500 boxes. Now you're up to almost 18,000 boxes ships going through. Now all of a sudden, LA and Long Beach are making this play. They're making the play to get the cargo back to them. So I think you're going to be able to go through. The limitation here, of course, is going to be available drayage. We've seen a big reduction in the number of trucks that are available on the West Coast because of things like pollution laws. There was issues with AB5 a year or two ago that created this issue about truckers staying in California. And then you have Class 1 rail limitations, because almost, 2/3 of the cargo that comes into LA and Long Beach now head east. They go, east of Texas, because 80% of the U.S. population is over there. If you don't have the warehouse spaces, you don't have the rail spaces, and you don't have the trucking, you can send all your stuff to LA and Long Beach. It's not going to go anywhere, because if your cargo was meant to go in the Savannah and then be offloaded in Columbia, South Carolina, that's your end destination. You still got to get there.
Yeah, it's interesting. So what we have within P44 is for each of our customers, they kind of go into the movement, the platform, they can see all of the affected containers. One really interesting thing that we're seeing for a lot of these containers that I wanted to get your take on, we're seeing containers destined for Savannah that are being discharged in the Bahamas.
Yep.
So I'm kind of curious.
So,
how do you manage that? And is there like a legitimate threat of, are these goods going to be stranded on the island?
Well, that's force majeure. You're seeing the container companies using that phrase and that key thing, because very much like what we saw with Ever Given at the Suez. If you watch what happened with Ever Given the Suez, ships piled up in the north and south side of the canal, and they were waiting and waiting because they were sitting there going, "Do I go around Africa or do I wait?" Right now it's economical to wait. I'm going to wait. But there's going to be a point when the container companies and container ships that arrive off the East and Gulf Coast are going to sit there and say, "It's time to cut losses." And I'm going to declare force majeure, act of God, act of nature. And I'm going to dump my containers wherever I want to get them off the boat so that I can go back and start hauling more. And what this may do, Eric, which is really a scary proposition, is not just in the Bahamas, but the big terminals, Algeciras, Tangier, Felixstowe, Salalah, Singapore. Containers are going to be dumped everywhere, and it's going to be a mess to set this up. When we talk about resetting a port, if you get a port shuts by a hurricane, for a day, it's going to take a week to get everything resettled. We're talking about shutting down nearly 50% of the container imports that come into the U.S. and, U.S. That's about 20 to 25% of global containers we're talking about. And, it's like all of a sudden going down a 4-lane highway and you find one of the lanes have a brick wall on it. There's no merge, no nothing. It's just a brick wall. Some of them are going to plow into it and it's going to be a mess. And what you're seeing right now is that impact.
Yep. And the longer this takes, the bigger and broader the impact, the more likelihood of force majeure, the more likelihood that it's in not just the Bahamas, but any of those ports you mentioned at any point in time. So really interesting. One thing, Sal, that you always do so well in what's going on with shipping is you talk about whether, supply chain or the supply web, right? Of how this affects things in the long term, what may have affected this. So in terms of thinking about how this is going to impact supply chains long term, talked about it a little bit. Can you put maybe a little finer point on it?
Yeah, I think one of the things we see right off the bat is I've been talking a lot is, number one, for the average consumer, don't panic, things are fine, everything's going to be there. But you're right. I think manufacturing is one of the biggest ones because of the nature of manufacturing and the fact that we're still operating on just-in-time logistics, because most people can't afford not to be on just-in-time logistics. I can't have a warehouse full of equipment waiting there. That's going to impact them. I think, the business that does it, the one business that's going to suffer the most right now is the one that doesn't have the visibility of where their cargo is right now. They don't realize that their containers are on a ship that's due in the Savannah tomorrow, but Savannah's not open. And they're thinking their stuff's going to be arriving all the time. But what they don't know is their shipper, their 3PL has moved the containers because they got out of the West Coast and now they're coming in the East Coast. So I think that's the big issue. So I think manufacturing is obviously number one. I think some high priority issues, medicines obviously is going to be another one that we'll see it in. Obviously imports, everybody's talking about olive oil and bananas coming in and some of those perishable items coming in. I think, the longer this goes, the more impacts it has, and also the more people start reacting to it. And I think that's going to be the unintended consequence. One of the reasons I think this doesn't go as long as some people are now saying is I think there's a negative blowback on the ILA at a certain point. When all of a sudden people are being affected on a multiple level, that it comes back to them. But I do think in manufacturing, I think in home building right now, a lot of those supplies are going in the big box stores going in. I'm always amazed when you look at the big companies like the Amazons, the Walmarts, the IKEAs. You think they would make up a huge percentage of the number of containers come in, but they actually make up a very low percentage of it. You take the top 20, it's only a few percentages. There's so many goods that are spread across. And I think that's the one that's going to be impacted the most, is probably the smaller to medium-sized business that does business, shipping goods in, but they don't really have a dedicated visibility on it. They're going to be impacted probably the most because they probably haven't thought ahead enough about this to front load their cargo. They haven't diverted the cargo. Those are the ones that are going to get really pinged. I have a friend who operates a very small business, and she's like, does that mean it's going to stop cargo from coming in? It's like, yes, that's exactly what it means. And all of a sudden their inventory is going to plummet all of a sudden, and that's their business.
So I like what you said. I think the biggest impact, at least specifically in short term, is if you don't have visibility into cargo. I have a company and a technology platform recommendation for you, but
Yeah.
but just to close this out, I think obviously still early, but there's always lessons to be learned here, and I think some of the stuff that you've been talking about on your channel for months, maybe this is, I think you called this a white swan event, which is something, hey, we could have predicted this. What are some of the lessons learned that you can apply, maybe prepare better for future disruptions if you're a company who's moving goods?
Well, I think if you're a company that's moving goods, you have to be thinking about, I know that cost is always the big issue. And by cost, you have to streamline. But when you streamline your supply chain, you take a risk. You literally, start narrowing your ability to funnel goods to you, via chain. A chain is only as good as its weakest link. If you go with a supply web model I like to advocate, then you have multiple access points. You can have a failure at one point, but the web still exists. There are alternative points to doing that. And, a lot of that visibility has to be there. I think the other element too is a big questioning about why was this allowed to happen? Everybody knew this was coming on. That's why I call it the white swan. It's like we knew at the end of 2018 that come September 30th of 2024, that contract expires. And if you listen to the ILA in June, it was pretty clear they were going to go on strike. They were talking about it there, not just their bosses, but the dock workers. And I think that's the element too, is like really listening and seeing what's going to happen. I'm really disappointed in the way the government has handled this in many ways. I think that, one of the things is I don't want government intervention. I'm not a big government intervention guy at all, but I do think that this is national security issues. And at the very least, they should be grabbing the scruff of the neck, the ILA and the U.S. Maritime Alliance, and putting them in a room and let's communicate with each other. Let's start hammering out a deal here. We saw lessons learned from the negotiation on the West Coast. And I think many sides took lessons from it. I think the ILA took a lesson from it, that we were going to strike, we were going to go on. But I think a lot of people who got jammed in on the West Coast took lessons from it too themselves and sat there and say, I'm not going to be 100% dependent on LA and Long Beach. I'm going to move some of my cargo to the East Coast. I'm going to diversify. I'm going to have a plan in place so that if I need to, I can move cargo, with as much notice as I can. And maybe if I'm putting on a ship in Shanghai and that ship is going, west and heading to the United States, maybe I'll put it on a ship going east and I'll pay a little bit more. I got to pay for rail and road and warehousing and, along the way, but I'll get it. One of the things that I learned more than anything else in the supply chain crisis of 2021, 2022 is people will pay money for increased reliability. If you can get increased reliability, because one of the things we saw is what happened in the supply chain crisis is reliability just tanked. I mean, it just tanked. It went from like 70, 80% delivery times of containers down to 20, 30%. And you were paying obscene amount of monies for the 20 and 30%. If you can get increased reliability, people will pay a little more because then they know that they're guaranteed, hey, it's going to take me a week or two longer to get my cargo, but I know I'm getting it in a week or two longer. If I go this way, I may get it, I may not. I'm spinning the wheel here, and I'm taking a chance.
Sal, as always, every time I learn, and so thank you for the insight. Thank you for the info. Make sure what's going on with shipping. Probably, so much great detail there. Strongly recommend everyone give it a follow, give it a listen. Thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it, Eric.
Cheers.